Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Laurel Kays, and I'm based out of North Carolina State University Extension Forestry, where I help coordinate outreach for the Southern Fire Exchange. Also on the line is David Godwin, who is our director, and Mary Nell Armstrong, who also helps coordinate outreach, both out of the University of Florida. So today I'm really excited about our presentation from Dr. Heather Alexander, who is the Assistant Professor of Forest Ecology at Auburn University. So today, Dr. Alexander will be talking about her recent research on current evidence for mesophication in upland oak landscapes, as well as gaps in that current knowledge. Now, finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Heather D. Alexander is an Assistant Professor of Forest and Fire Ecology in the School of Forestry and Wildlife Sciences at Auburn University. Her research focuses on understanding forest ecosystem vulnerability in the face of changing fire disturbance regimes, using observations across natural gradients and field-based experimental manipulations. She has studied the implications of fire suppression and mesophication on oak and mixed forests of the eastern US for over 15 years. So welcome, Heather, and you can go ahead and share your screen and give us just 1 minute to switch out presentations.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. Today, I'm going to talk to you about a topic that I've been thinking a lot about since I started my PhD way back in 2004, my goodness, at the University of Kentucky, working under the supervision of Dr. Mary Arthur. And at that point, we were thinking mostly about putting fire back into upland oak stands that hadn't experienced fire for 80 plus years or so. And this was mostly in the Southern Appalachian region. And once we started to restore fire into those systems, it was interesting what we were seeing. You know, we were really surprised at how well species like red maple were proliferating, despite the fact that we were burning them, and they were persisting, even though we were putting fire back into the system multiple times. And we were having some trouble getting the desired results with oak regeneration that we were hoping to get by restoring this fire disturbance that we thought was this really key player in getting oaks to regenerate. And so at that point, I started thinking a lot about the mesophication topic. And I'm going to go more into that in a minute and explain sort of the history of that and what it's all about. But over the years, I've talked to a lot of my colleagues and students, and we've done some research, and we finally took a lot of our thoughts and thinking about the mesophication process in upland oak landscapes and turned that into a recently published paper in Bioscience. And I want to really thank my co-authors, because this presentation, even though I'm giving it, is really the culmination of a lot of different research and a lot of different ideas from these folks, as well as many others. But there were 9 of us on this paper, and you can see everybody here. We represented multiple institutions, different types of expertise in the fire world, and had co-authors at numerous different stages in their careers. And so we had lots of different perspectives on this topic coming together to get this paper on mesophication and what that means for oak landscapes. So oak landscapes have dominated the central and eastern US they were here prior to European settlement, and they came into dominance about 8,000 to 16,000 years ago at the end of the last glaciation event, as the climate began to warm and dry. And early photos, like the one on the left, and descriptions of the region from the time of around European settlement describe the landscape as one dominated by oak savannas and woodlands. So you had large overstory oaks, a very sparse midstory, and a robust and species-rich herbaceous understory. Today, oak landscapes still dominate much of the eastern US, and overstory oaks continue to grow in size and volume, as you can see by the large swaths of green on the map to the left that show changes in oak volume between 1980 and 2005. but the trees no longer exist in an open woodland structure, and they're in really densely packed closed canopy forest instead. And importantly, instead of oak saplings regenerating beneath the oak overstory, there are many other species, and these tend to be shade-loving, often fire-sensitive, and or opportunistic species like maples and beeches. We often refer to these species as mesophytic species as opposed to pyrophytic species like upland oaks and pines. So depicted in these graphs is the relative proportion of different tree species on the y-axis across different size classes on the x-axis. So seedling, sapling, mid-story, and overstory individuals. And this is at 3 different sites in the eastern US, with an Indiana site to the north, a central site in Kentucky, and then a northern Mississippi site in the most southern part of the graph. So pyrophytic oaks are in red. We group them into either the red oak group or the white oak group. And then the more mesophytic species are in shades of blue or gray. And this is a color scheme that I'm going to use throughout the presentation today. And what you'll notice is that if you look at the overstory first, that on all these sites, there's a considerable amount of overstory oaks. And then if you look to the seedling size class, there are a number of seedlings that are establishing in the understory. But oak species are underrepresented in the midstory and sapling size classes relative to their proportion in the overstory. And this is very concerning for a lot of researchers and managers, because what this means is that as these large overstory oaks die, they're going to be replaced by other species, beeches, maples, elms, other species that are typically more mesophytic than our pyrophytic oaks and pines. And this phenomena is often referred to as the oak sapling bottleneck. So this trend has generated considerable concern about the long-term consequences for ecosystem function across these landscapes. Oaks are a foundation genus because of their dominance and pronounced effects on ecosystem processes. Acorns constitute a portion of at least 96 avian and mammal species diets, and they're a critical food source for many species during the winter. They're also the most important North American genus for insect herbivores, so they provide a very essential base for terrestrial food chains. Losing oak woodlands and savannas will decrease the abundance of countless wildlife species that use those open canopy areas for nesting, brooding cover, and foraging. And there will be consequences for ecosystem function beyond that in terms of how water and nutrients, carbon are stored in these cycles, because oaks strongly influence these processes. And then oaks are a highly desired hardwood timber species used for floors, cabinets, and in the production of bourbon barrels. You can see in the article on the right. So the question that has come up in these systems is whether or not Musification can explain why this shift is happening. And the Musification Hypothesis was first coined in 2008 by Nowacki and Abrams. And it proposes that fire exclusion encourages the densification of stands by understory and midstory individuals of these shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive, or highly opportunistic tree species. We're going to refer to these as mesophytes, whose traits then create shadier, cooler, and wetter conditions in the understory, and a leaf litter fuel bed that dampens fire. All of those conditions acting together serve to perpetuate mesophytes while hindering more pyrophytic species like oak and pine. So this is a positive feedback loop where conditions continually improve for mesophytes while they become less and less conducive to the growth and survival of pyrophytes. It's important to note that this hypothesis differs from traditional forest successional theory, which focuses primarily on changes in light conditions and individual species shade tolerances. That is important, but this is a feedback loop that recognizes that individual trees can influence their understory growing conditions beyond impacts on light, importantly impacts on moisture. and that this can change the potential for fire to be an important disturbance in these systems. So this paper by Nowacki and Abrams is very highly cited. People refer to Musification a lot in upland oak landscapes. And what we wanted to do, though, was really explore the Musification process, looking at it step by step. So we took the idea that Nowacki and Abrams presented in that paper, and we sort of distilled it down into the figure you see on the left here. So there's 4 steps to the Musification, or phases, we call them. Phase 1 is this fire exclusion leading to mesophyte proliferation. Phase 2 is this creation of shadier, cooler, wetter, lower fuel understory conditions by the mesophytes themselves. Phase 3 is the reduction in flammability that occurs because of that. And phase 4 is that because of these conditions, you see mesophytes doing well beneath themselves, while oaks are not. And it's important to note that mesophication is more than the compositional shifts. So you hear researchers a lot attributing the diminishing oak dominance to mesophication, but usually we're referring only to that well-documented proliferation of those fire-sensitive, shade-tolerant species, like I showed you in the graph of the 3 locations across the US. But mesophication is more than that. It's the positive feedback cycle I just described. So again, taking a look at this step by step, we thought that that could be important because it could potentially help explain why implementing fire and reducing mesophyte encroachment into some of these upland oak sites is increasingly difficult. And it's not as simple as simply putting fire back into the ecosystem, even though we believe that fire is a really important disturbance there. So phase 1 of the Musification hypothesis, like I just mentioned, speculates that long-term fire exclusion from oak landscapes fostered the proliferation of mesophytes. So this is intentional fire exclusion that started in the early 1900s, or really became pronounced in the early 1900s that we're talking about here. So the exclusion of fire led to increased competition with oaks and reduced oak recruitment into the canopy. This is really the idea that's been the focus of what's called the fire oak hypothesis, this was first coined by Abrams in 1992. He published a paper in Bioscience. And the fire oak hypothesis posits that periodic low to moderate intensity surface fires maintain upland oak dominance by reducing competition from fire-sensitive species and maintaining a highly flammable herbaceous fuel bed beneath a relatively open canopy. And that oaks have adaptations that allow them to survive and persist in these environments, including a prolific resprouting capacity following top kill, thick bark, low to moderate shade tolerance, and drought tolerance. And once they establish, they have crown, bark, and leaf litter traits that perpetuate a warmer, drier, and more flammable understory environment, which would then promote the continued dominance of oaks in these ecosystems. So there are some key links between oak dominance and fire prevalence. One of them is the paleoecological pollen and charcoal records, which are shown on the left here. And these are really cool. There's a bunch of these from a variety of sites across the eastern US. This one is from Anderson Pond, which is in Tennessee. And what it's showing, and sometimes these are hard to look at, but it's showing more recent times at the top of the graph and then going all the way back to 23,000 years ago. And it's showing charcoal remnants, or the area of charcoal in the sediments and the concentration and that bar graph. And then it shows the pollen of different species that were found across the landscape. And I'm just showing a few here. But one thing I want to point out is that there's sort of 2 periods of heavy charcoal presence during that time period. The last 8,000 years ago, and then there was kind of a break, and then all the way back to 23,000 years ago. What you'll notice is that 23 to about 15,000 year ago time period, that's when pines and spruces, it was much cooler, dominated, and fire was prevalent in that time. And then there's sort of a decline in fire in the middle, and that's when you start to see Australia and Carpinus, so eastern hop hornbeam and musselwood species and these are considered mesophytes proliferating. But then as oak dominance during that warming period starts to increase, we have more and more fire. So when oaks are dominant along that landscape, there is fire across the landscape. And then upland oaks have adaptations, both morphological and physiological traits that indicate their evolution with fire. Like I just described, this thick bark, efficient wounding response, and precipitous growth of sprouting stems when they're top killed when not shaded. And this is in contrast to species like red maple that tend to have a thin bark, high shade tolerance, and a non-conservative growth strategy. And then we also have dendrochronological analyses of fire scars, which you can see here on the left, an example that confirm the widespread frequent fires during or just prior to the establishment of current upland oak overstories. So the figure on the right, each one of those lines, we have two different sites, BDS and SHA, and each of those horizontal lines represents a different tree sample. The little black triangles on each of those lines is a fire scar in the wood. And then the vertical lines down at the bottom of each of those sites represents a fire event, the detection of there were enough wounding on trees that we could call this a fire event. And what you notice is that before the 1930s or so, that there were frequent fires across the landscape. And then after the 1930s or so, fires became less and less prevalent. And stand reconstructions reveal that failed oak regeneration and increased mesophyte establishment following fire exclusion in uplands began around the 1930s. So those changes in fire were reflected in the establishment of oaks versus maples here. And this is a site in southern Ohio. There are there are 4 sites in southern Ohio. Each show frequency of oak establishment, which are the black bars, and maple establishment, which are the hatched bars, and the vertical lines beneath each of the sites show when a fire occurred. If it's a vertical arrow instead of just a line, it means it was a significant fire event. So most of the trees were scarred in this study. So we have lots of oak establishment during this period with lots of fires prior to the 1920s or so, when fire exclusion became really pronounced across the eastern US, and lots of maple establishment following that period. So really maples were not coming in on those sites prior to fire exclusion. And then we have all sorts of witness tree and historical accounts like that shown here from a 1935 publication that document a prevalence of oak-dominated open savannas and woodlands and a scarcity of mesophytic closed canopy forest in the uplands. So combined, this evidence points to a strong influence of fire exclusion on observed structural and compositional shifts across these upland oak landscapes. So phase 1 in the Musification process, there seems to be quite a bit of evidence for an impact of fire exclusion. But it's important to recognize that although fire exclusion undoubtedly contributed to these shifts, other environmental and biological changes co-occurred with fire exclusion and could have exacerbated these shifts by limiting fire potential or favoring mesophytes over oaks. One thing notable is that climate has been exceptionally wet with reduced drought severity and frequency during the last century. This may have reduced fire frequency and favored growth and survival of the diffuse porous mesophytes over ring porous oaks. We've also experienced dramatic changes in herbivore pressure. So herbivory from white-tailed deer has been shown to limit oak regeneration on many sites. Potentially fire exclusion may have reduced available forage, making oaks a preferred browse, subsequently shifting the competitive edge to mesophytes. But I think more importantly is that prior to European settlement, herbivory by large herbivores like wood bison and eastern elk and other herbivores it was common in the region. And this likely interacted with fire to maintain the dominance of pyrophytic trees and an open canopied structure, similar to other savanna and woodland ecosystems across the globe. And then we had things like the loss of passenger pigeons and the American chestnut that may have hindered oaks by altering canopy structure and forest flammability. So large flocks of passenger pigeons would perch atop forest canopies. They created pulses of woody fuels and large canopy gaps by breaking limbs, and American chestnut was among the most flammable upland species in the region. And then we've had pronounced atmospheric nitrogen deposition in the central and eastern US since industrialization, and increases in nitrogen have been associated with increased growth and survival of some mesophytic species compared to oaks. So basically, the idea here is that even if fire is the keystone disturbance that maintain oak savannas and woodlands, other factors likely interacted with fire to initiate oak decline in the past. So we contend that we'll never really know the exact combination of factors that came together to limit oak regeneration across every site. But what's most important now is that successfully managing for upland oak regeneration today really depends on understanding the current day limitations to fire, which may hinge on the vegetation fire feedback loops that act to promote or suppress fire, which are the phases 2 through 4 in the Musification Hypothesis and are highlighted in blue here. So fire exclusion, clearly important for oak regeneration, but there's lots of other things going on, and it's not as simple as simply returning fire to the landscape. And there was a synthesis report that came out in 2004 by Brose et al. That took all the literature on putting fire into oak landscapes and synthesized it. And what they found is that single fires really do a whole lot of nothing for oak regeneration, but that there's promise for multiple fires. But even when you put multiple fires on the landscape, you don't always get positive results. So there are some other things going on here. Okay, so moving to phase 2 of the Musification hypothesis, mesophytes create a shadier and consequently cooler and more humid understory with higher fuel moisture and consistently lower fuel loads than oaks. So that's what we're looking at here. And a shadier and consequently cooler understory is typically assumed because species encroaching into oak landscapes are usually shade-tolerant species. And as we found in a recent study, these species have higher leaf area and deeper crowns than oaks. So this is showing differences in crown volume between 2 oaks, chestnut oak and white oak, which are red bars, and 4 potential mesophytes in blue. So we have pignut hickory, red maple, sugar maple, and American beech. And these traits maximize light capture and survival in low light, but they also obstruct light from reaching the forest floor, especially withstand densification. And as you can see in this figure to the right, with substantially less light beneath mesophytes than oak. So there is this reduction in light reaching the forest floor when you have species that have more leaf area and more crown volume. And not only does this mean that moderately shade-tolerant upland oaks will likely perform poorly under these mesophytic canopies, but these dense canopies reflect light and they absorb more heat, which allows less energy to the forest floor, which likely reduces evaporation and keeps fuels moisture. So this idea that reduced drying rates and shady conditions increases fuel moisture was explored in a recent study by Cry and others, where they took fuels of pine and oaks and exposed them to either an open canopy or shaded conditions, which you can see in the pictures here. So they built this really cool contraption where they've got a thermal infrared camera on top of that frame on the left-hand picture, and then they have these shade structures in the fuel beds beneath them, and you can see kind of a close-up of that on the right. And they took these thermal infrared pictures to detect temperature change, and it's pretty cool to see here how fuel temperatures vary dramatically in shaded and unshaded conditions over the course of the day. So in these images, we're starting at 9:30 local time in the morning and then going to 11:30 a.m. and 13:30 p.m. And the blue colors are cool temperatures and the reddish and orangish colors are warmer temperatures. And it's pretty clear where the shade structures were versus the open areas. And you can actually, if you look closely, kind of see where the oak leaves stand out in that fuel bed compared to the pine. But clearly, whether or not the fuels are shaded has an impact on fuel temperature. So mesophytes could also increase fuel moisture by influencing how rainwater is captured and spatially redistributed to the forest floor. So differences in bark morphology, the water storage capacity of the bark, and the geometry of the crown of different species affect rainwater partitioning into stem flow. So that's the water that runs down the trunks, through fall, which is the water that drips from crowns, and water that gets intercepted or captured by the crowns. So here you can see an oak with a thick rough bark and a mesophyte with a thin smooth bark. And this figure on the left demonstrates those differences in thickness, with our two oaks, white oak and chestnut oak, having substantially thicker bark than the four mesophytes that I mentioned in the previous slide. And now on the right graph here, you can see how the smoother, thinner barked mesophytic species like red maple and American beech are able to capture and funnel somewhere between 2 and 20 times more rainfall as stem flow compared to the rougher bark oak species. And this increased stem flow could be very important because it may create a zone of higher fuel moisture in the immediate area surrounding the bole of these trees, which you can see here in this figure, where volumetric water content on the left axis, which is presented relative to the stand average, is greater near the bole of red maple than Maconet hickory and two oaks. And this could serve as another mechanism by which mesophytes persist in relatively dry habitats, because basically they're generating and funneling a ton of water into a narrow zone around their bole. And it's a way that potentially could protect these trees from fire damage if fuels are moister in that zone. And this could be especially important in the region because most prescribed fires are conducted within only a few days of a precipitation event. Mesophytes could also increase fuel moisture and reduce fuel loads through their leaf litter traits. For example, on upland sites in Kentucky, we found all the mesophytes except for American beech decompose substantially faster than the oaks. So especially red maple and sugar maple. And this graph on the left is showing leaf litter mass loss over a year using a traditional litter bag study. Again, the more mesophytic species are in shades of blue and the oaks are in reds. And you can really see that sugar maple and red maple especially decompose faster than either one of any of the three oak species we looked at. And based on these estimates, these differences in decomposition rates between oaks and maples could lead to substantial reductions in fuel loads. So a switch from oak to maple dominance could decrease fuel loads by an estimated 400 kilograms per hectare per year. Whoops. And these faster decomposition rates could help explain the lower fuel loads and higher fuel bed density in maple-dominated stands compared to stands dominated by oaks in this study in Ohio by Dickinson and other on the left, where you can see that both loading the top panel and bulk density change with the composition of the stand, with less loading beneath maple-dominated stands and more loading in the oak-dominated stands, and the inverse trend for bulk density. And they found a decrease in fuel loads in both the litter layer and the organic layer with increasing mesophyte contribution to the basal area. So as more mesophytes encroach into these stands and occupy more of the basal area, the litter loads decline. This is really important, these upland oak stands, because the primary source of fuel to move a fire is the litter layer. Leaf litter saturation studies, similar to the one that's set up on the left in this picture, show that increasing the presence of mesophytic litter into a pyrophytic oak litter fuel bed increases the amount of water that's absorbed, resulting in wetter litter beds throughout the drying process until the beds reach equilibrium. So the graph that's on the left shows this trend for single species fuel beds, while that one on the right is for mixed beds. And it's key to note that species like winged elm and sweet gum absorb more water, and they have a slower drying rates of the litter than the oak species do. And that the moisture holding capacity increases with increasing mesophyte contribution to the fuel bed, which you can see in the graph on the right. So the more non-oak leaf litter there is in the fuel bed, the higher fuel moisture content and the slower that litter dries over time. These differential moisture responses are linked to differences in leaf morphology among the species, which are shown here. This is a principal component analysis that takes a lot of different leaf litter traits and then arranges them so that points that are more closely related are closer together on the PCA than those that are further apart. And we're looking at things like leaf thickness, the specific leaf area of the leaves, the density of leaf, the mass and the volume. And the key point to this is that you can see how the oaks, which are in shades of red, separate out from the mesophytes in shades of blue. So the oaks tend to kind of group over to the right and the mesophytes group over to the left. And if you kind of look at the details of what's going on here, the mesophytic leaves tend to be smaller and they're less dense and they're lighter with lower volume, while the oak leaves tend to be larger, more dense and heavier and have higher volume. This leads to the traits of the mesophyte leaves lead to higher fuel bed density and higher moisture retention. So all of the studies I just mentioned focus on leaf litter differences among mesophyte and oak species. It's really important to understand that a more shaded understory beneath a mesophytic closed canopy stand could also reduce fuel moisture and loads by altering the ground layer vegetation. So closed canopy forests typically contain sparse species-poor ground layer vegetation. The warm season grasses like andropogon that were once common in the understory of fire-maintained oak-dominated woodlands in the Mid-South are now largely restricted to edges, canopy gaps, or xeric sites of fire-excluded forests because these grasses don't tolerate shade and a deep leaf litter layer. So there's a study by Vander Yacht et al. Presented at the bottom here that shows that ground cover really declines as the stand basal area increases and the canopy closure increases. So during phase 3 of the Musification process, the shadier, cooler, and wetter understory environment that's created by mesophytes reduces flammability because of both overstory shading and the compositional and structural shifts that affect leaf morphology and fuel bed moisture and loads like we just talked about in phase 2. So both modeled fire line intensity, which is shown on the graph on the left, and maple, mixed, and oak stands, and laboratory experiments like that on the right that burn the dry leaf litter of pyrophytes and mesophytes reveal consistent patterns. So fuel beds with more pyrophytic leaf litter burn with greater intensity and higher fuel consumption. They extinguish more rapidly than those with more mesophytic litter, which burns poorly, has shorter flame heights, and lower fuel consumption. And the graph on the right shows, importantly, that if you manipulate moisture conditions, so you have things that are dried more at the top compared, or with the black circles compared to things that are more moist with the white circles, that the flammability changes, but the trends remain the same. So flammability differences persist under different moisture under different moisture regimes. So you have more mesophytes in the fuel bed, you have lower flammability, but this persists regardless of whether or not it's very, very dry or more wet. And then we also tested these ideas in some small scale experimental burns during the late dormant season using single and multiple species fuel beds of oaks and encroaching non-oaks under field conditions. And so we did this study at Spirit Hill Farm in North Mississippi, where we constructed field beds of oak or mesophytic litter in these 2 meter by 2 meter plots, like you can see in the image here. We ignited those plots and we measured flammability metrics like duration of flame, rate of spread, flame height, and fuel combustion. And these studies revealed similar trends to the laboratory studies where oak fuel beds burned easily. You can see that the fire moved across the entire plot and it consumed most of the litter, while species like winged elm often failed to ignite or only burned in the area that was up against the torch fuel. You can see that right-hand side is darker, and that's where we ignited the plot. And so this image shows the 5 single species fuel beds during and after fire. We had southern red oak, post oak, hickory, sweet gum, and winged elm. And southern red oak and post oak burned pretty well. They had faster spread rates, higher temperatures, taller flames. More of the area that we ignited was burned. And then that decreased, moving into hickory, sweet gum, and winged elm being the least flammable of the species. We looked at winged elm. Winged elm is really problematic on more southern sites where species like red maple and sugar maple tend to be more problematic moving north, at least in my, based on my observations. So I'm going to show you a couple quick videos here. This is some field burning of southern red oak in a recent study that we're doing in mixed stands. And what it shows is that, you know, when you ignite oak litter, it burns pretty well. By the time, I'm not going to show you the whole video or we'd be sitting here for about 5 minutes or so, but even after we laid down the torch fuel, the fuel ignites, it spreads, and it'll consume that entire plot. But then if you look at something like sweet gum, we're going to lay down the torch fuel here up at the top of the screen. And again, I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but I'll tell you that what happens here is that the flame front starts to move, and these are head fires. And not long after that torch fuel is consumed, the flames will start to go out. And it stops here, I think, very soon. But basically, that little strip that you see in that sweet gum bed is all that burned. And that was right up against the torch fuel. And so those sort of showing the different extremes of how fire moves these different litter beds. And so phase 4 of the Musification process is that shadier, cooler, and moister conditions with reduced flammability that would occur beneath mesophytes will promote mesophyte regeneration and spread while hindering that of oaks. So in general, shade-tolerant mesophytes have higher growth and photosynthetic rates and survival under shadier, moister conditions, and they more rapidly take advantage of changing light conditions compared to our principally shade-intolerant upland oaks. There's not a whole lot of research on this, interestingly, where studies have directly compared the regeneration of mesophytes beneath mesophytes compared to pyrophytes and vice versa. But the few studies that have done this show that mesophyte regeneration has pretty high survival and growth beneath both mesophyte and oak overstories, whereas oak regeneration does well beneath itself, but poorly beneath mesophytes. So here, this is modeled results from a study that came out in 1994 by Canham et al. And they looked at predicted mortality rates of saplings for a variety of different species under that species itself or all the other species that they looked at. And so like FAGR, that's American beech, TSCA is Tsuga canadensis or hemlock, and then we've got sugar maple, there's cherry, white pine, red maple, white ash, and then at the very far right is northern red oak, and the same species going down. But basically what I want to point out here is that if you look at northern red oak here, you can see that sapling mortality is highest underneath American beech and hemlock, pretty high underneath sugar maple, but it's lowest underneath itself and white ash. So, you know, even under red maple, the percent mortality is 2.1, it's only 0.1 underneath itself. So proportionally, that's much higher underneath a red maple compared to underneath a northern red oak. But if you look at red maple, it still has pretty high mortality underneath an American beech, but much less than the northern red oak. And it does just fine beneath itself. It has much lower mortality than an oak does beneath itself than the oak does. And so basically the idea here is that mesophytes kind of care less where they're growing. They can deal with the canopy beneath an oak or themselves, where oaks really need that more sparse, higher light canopy. So overall, in our step-by-step exploration of the musification process, we found that tree traits like canopy, bark, and leaf litter can promote or suppress fire through multiple mechanisms, like their impact on fuel moisture or fuel loads, and that this could help to perpetuate or hinder a tree depending on that tree's particular fire tolerance. But there are many gaps that remain. You know, if our current knowledge is that circle over to the left and our target knowledge is over there to the right, there's a gap in there. So it's really important, I think, to test the Musification hypothesis and its role in declining oak dominance, because I think it can help us plan for when and where fire and other management tools most effectively promote oak regeneration. But we need to explore several other key aspects of the hypothesis. One thing that I think is super important to think about is whether or not these self-perpetuating processes that are acting at the tree level can perpetuate to or propagate to the stand and the landscape scale. So you can imagine individual trees of any size affecting understory conditions through their crown and leaf litter and bark traits. So they have this zone of influence underneath them. And if these understory conditions affect fuel moisture and loads, then these tree level zones should eventually converge and interact with those of other tree species and ground layer vegetation to influence flammability. And therefore, our ability to use prescribed fire as a restoration tool at the stand or the landscape level. So understanding these inherently spatial processes will likely require that we develop spatial models that can tease out the complexity of these interacting individuals of various species and sizes. And another thing that's really important to consider is whether or not these self-perpetuating elements are strong enough to overcome broad-scale phenomena like climate change and its interaction with fire. And so future increases in drought frequency and severity are likely to favor oaks over mesophytes on many sites by increasing both fire activity and limiting the growth of water-living mesophytes. So you can see the predicted number of days over 35 on the map on the left, and it's supposed to get warmer and drier across most of the southeastern region of the US. And then the predicted changes in forest that go with that on the right. And the main thing for you to look at here is changes in green, because greens are oak pine and oak hickory forests. And while a big chunk of the eastern US is occupied by them now, according to FIA data and other data on the top two panels, those areas are predicted to increase, which you can see under high and low emissions in the four maps at the bottom of that graph. But basically the idea is, you know, if climate is interacting with fire at larger scales, then, you know, maybe these species differences mean nothing, you know, so then maybe they get dampened by these changes and larger scale phenomena. And so it's important to understand when that happens. And then alternatively, some areas in the regions are actually predicted to experience really heavy pulsed rainfall events with climate change. And we've seen this on some of our sites in Mississippi. And this could act to foster mesophyte spread, and more importantly, make it harder and harder for us to put fire onto the landscape. And then I think it's really important to understand how these vegetation fire feedback loops vary among tree species. We typically group tree species into broad categories: pyrophyte, mesophyte, hardwood, conifer, but species clearly differ in their traits associated with flammability, their ability to persist in fire-prone environments, and their tolerance of varying climatic conditions. And so this graph on the left is a study by Varner et al. In Fire Ecology, where they looked at differences in oak flammability just among the oak species that occur in the Southeast. And what they found is that there's pretty distinct differences. There are avoiders like live oak and sand live oak. There are mesophytes like water oak and laurel oak. And then there are these pyrophytic oaks like turkey oak and blackjack oak and sandpost oak that really have different traits than other oaks. So there are a lot of different species effects. And then a really recent study by Kane et al. That looked at flammability differences between 3 oaks and red maple versus sugar maple, and found that sugar maple is a quite different species than red maple, even though we tend to lump maples together. And red maple, as many of us know, behaves quite differently on the landscape. And so I think understanding these species levels are very, very different, especially because most of our models that predict flammability rely on general fuel types like hardwood litter or plant functional types like temperate broadleaf deciduous, but these cannot capture the species level differences in flammability, although they clearly exist. And then one thing that is important to think about is how do we apply these small scale results that we do either in the lab or in small scale field experiments. How do they apply when you start thinking about in situ wildland fires? So we have strong evidence that shifts in forest composition could be important, but when you start thinking about broader landscapes with more heterogeneity and changes in topography, it gets a little bit more complicated. So a couple of key take-home thoughts about all of this. One is that Musification is more than compositional and structural shifts. It's a positive feedback cycle where tree traits act to reinforce or suppress fire. So when we think about Musification, we should be thinking about all 4 phases of that hypothesis, not just phase 1. And then shifting the mesophytic state back to open canopied savannas and woodlands by reintroducing fire alone, which is the primary disturbance that we thought induced the shift, is often not enough. We have really mixed results from putting fire back onto the landscape. And that could be because, well, maybe we just haven't given fire enough time to do what it needs to do. Or maybe there are other things that fire interacts with that could be super important for limiting oak regeneration, things like herbivory or the phenology of fire and when we put fire on the ground. Or maybe it's because these feedback loops that I just discussed between mesophytes and their understory reduce flammability and promote their own persistence, decreasing the effectiveness of fire. So this is super important to think about, I think. And then clearly there are many knowledge gaps that we need to explore in terms of mesophication of oak landscapes and how do we apply that at larger scales and across species and in a world where things like climate are changing rapidly. All right, well, thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. That was really great. We do have a couple of questions already, and we have a couple minutes yet, so folks can continue to type those in the QA box if they have them. You can, well, I'll go ahead and share my screen if you want to stop.
Yeah,
sharing.
let me stop sharing maybe and
All right.
turn my camera on.
All right. Okay. So the first question was just about the methods of the work you were discussing and whether you pre-dried the fuels before burning those 2x2 litter areas you were showing.
So what we did on those was we put down a known amount of pre-dried fuels because we wanted to standardize how much fuel we were putting down on the ground. And we based that on previous studies where we knew what the typical fuel load was in those forests. So we pre-dried it, but we put it down in January, which is the time, around the time that most of the litter comes down in those forests, and we let it sit on those plots until March, which would be a dormant season burn and a time when fires are commonly set. And so the fuels had undergone changes during that 3-month period due to weather and other things.
Thanks. So this is maybe a little bit outside your area of expertise, but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about it. There was a question about how to gain support to thin and burn these oak forests to maintain oaks when a lot of people are opposed to that and other folks are promoting the need to maximize forest carbon instead? How do you gain support for trying to do that sort of restoration?
Yeah, that's a really good question and something that I come up across all the time. You're right, it's not exactly what I study, but I do refer to my colleagues and others who've done a lot of work on exactly how much fire doesn't really damage hardwoods when you burn them, as long as you burn them right. So Joe Marshall and others who are a big part of the Oak Woodland and Fire Consortium he actually sent me the other day, and maybe I can find it and we can post it, a link to some recent workshops and publications that they have coming out, sort of demonstrating that fire, when applied appropriately, has minimal impact on your hardwood timber resource. And I think that's a really important message, because there's still that kind of paradigm that fire doesn't belong in hardwood systems, especially in the Southeast. And based on everything I've studied, that's simply not true. And so I think that's part of it, is just getting that information out there and having more talks on forums like this about that phenomena. And what was the other part of the question?
Related to carbon sequestration and folks who are really interested about that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's tricky too, right? Because I think in some ways you could actually improve carbon sequestration by burning, because what you're doing is you're opening up things, you're reducing competition, you're creating an environment where trees could potentially grow bigger faster and putting more volume into wood than they would if they're growing in this closed canopy, resource limited environment. And so I think you could argue, there could be lots of arguments that fire could actually help with that rather than hinder that.
Thanks. So did you in your work assess the role of any exotic invasives, both woody and herbaceous?
Not directly, but we have, so one of my graduate students, Caleb Goldsmith, who may be on here, he actually did some cool work about Japanese stiltgrass, because that's one of the species that's particularly problematic on sites that we've been burning, both in northern Mississippi and in Kentucky. And there's some hesitancy among managers to put fire on the landscape when these invasive species are around. And what Caleb's work showed was that, there's definitely an effect of microstegium on tree regeneration, but in his work, the white oak was the oak we looked at compared to red maple and sweet gum. It was actually least impacted by the presence of microstegium than those two. And it was only a year study, and perhaps more negative effects would become more pronounced as that later in the life history of that tree. But I think that clearly it's an issue, but you have to I think it's more risky to do nothing in terms of management than to let that invasive species like microstegium dictate whether or not you put fire on the landscape, in my personal opinion.
So you mentioned in your last couple of slides that there's still quite a lot we don't know about this. What are your plans for future research, and what are things that you really want to look at next?
Yeah, so we're continuing to do these small scale experimental burns. We're doing some work in mixed stands now, because one thing I think is interesting is because I just moved to Auburn, and now that I'm more embedded in the Southeast, I'm realizing that mesophication is not an upland oak phenomena. It's happening in pine forests that haven't seen fire in a long time as well, with things like water oak and sweet gum and laurel oaks. And I think I want to do some more work investigating those effects in these systems, along with these experimental burns that we're now doing in mixed stands. So thinking about how much pine litter you need in your fuel bed in order to maintain the pyrophytic nature of the stand. So just having a little bit of pine, we think, might be really important for maintaining kind of a pyrophytic state. So we're doing some of that work. And then I really, really, really want to do some work thinking about the spatial processes and working with some spatial modelers to think about those zones of influence and how they might propagate out from individual trees across the landscape to influence flammability at broader scales.
Cool. So I know we're right about at time, but one last question, since you sort of referenced it a little bit. Do you know or do we know whether there are stand composition thresholds where mesophication starts to be really important? You mentioned that if there's a couple pines in a stand, that can help. Do you know like a more specific number or percentage threshold?
So that's the other question, right? We're trying to figure that out as well. What our findings from the litter bed studies, as well as some of those from Jesse Cry and Morgan Varner, it looks like it's about 66% of the fuel contribution by mesophytes is when you really, I mean, there's a linear effect. The more you have, the less flammable it gets, but around 66% seems to be where it's really hard to get it to burn. Unless there's caveats to that, right? Because I think if the weather was really, really dry and hot, which are probably conditions that would be outside of prescription, then you might get it to burn. But then it becomes harder and harder to control in those situations. So I think at least based on fuel mass, it's about 66%.
Thanks. So we are right at 2 o'clock, and I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you all for your great questions. If you would like to follow up with Dr. Alexander, her information is on the screen. Her contact info is there. So Dr. Alexander, thank you again so much for your time today. That was really great. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope this webinar was useful to you and hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you for having me. Everybody take care.